There is a moment late in life when the room grows quieter than you expected. The letters have been read. The voices have faded. Even the kettle has stopped its low, steady noise. And yet, something remains. Not the empire, not the victories, not even the weight of decisions that once felt unbearable. It is people, or rather, what people turn out to be once time has had its say. He may have noticed it slowly, not in a single betrayal, not in anything dramatic, just a series of small shifts. A voice that once sounded certain, becoming hesitant. A presence that once felt steady, growing distant. A promise, quietly losing its shape. They don't always leave in obvious ways. Most of the time they simply become smaller than you remember, less consistent, less certain, less able to carry what they once seemed to offer. And once you begin to see that, you find yourself going back through your memories, noticing things you didn't question at the time. The pauses, the half-answers, the moments that didn't quite sit right. It's subtle, almost easy to miss. But once it settles in, you don't quite see people the same way again. By the end of his life, Marcus Aurelius had likely grown used to a certain kind of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind that comes after people have said everything they intend to say. He would have heard enough by then. Assurances, promises, carefully chosen words that sounded right in the moment. And over time, they begin to blur, not because they were all false, but because they were rarely tested. You hear enough of them, and something shifts. You stop listening to what people say. You begin watching what they do when it becomes inconvenient to stay the same. There is a small gesture he might have repeated without thinking, holding a letter for a moment longer than necessary, reading the first lines, then folding it again, not out of distrust, just a kind of distance, because after a while, words lose a bit of their weight. Outside, perhaps the street was wet, light stretching across the pavement in uneven reflections. The sort of evening where everything feels slightly slowed down, and in that quiet, something becomes easier to notice. People do not disappear all at once. They rarely make a scene. They adjust, a little less present, a little slower to respond, a little more careful with their tone. Nothing dramatic, just enough that if you weren't paying attention, you might call it nothing. But he had begun to pay attention, not to what changed loudly, but to what changed quietly. Because it is not when everything is calm that you see people clearly. It is when something small becomes uncomfortable, when staying the same requires effort. That is when the edges begin to show. And once you've seen that, it becomes difficult to return to the way you saw people before. Not impossible, but uncomfortable, as if something doesn't quite align anymore. And perhaps that was the beginning of it, not a discovery, just a slow, quiet understanding that what unsettles you most about people is not what they do in the open, but what shifts when it would have been easier to remain unchanged. It is a quiet thing realizing you may have been looking at people slightly incorrectly, not entirely wrong, just not quite as they are. We don't often notice it at first, because most of the time people give us enough to believe in, a certain tone, a way of listening, a few well-placed words that seem to land exactly where they should. And from that, something begins to form, not in them, in us, a version of who we think they are. It happens subtly, a conversation that feels genuine, a moment where they understand you almost too well, a sense that this person is steady, and you don't say it out loud, you don't declare it, but somewhere in the background, you begin to rely on it. You begin to expect it, not in obvious ways, just small, quiet expectations, that they will remain the same, that they will respond the same way next time, that what you felt in that moment reflects something consistent. But perhaps that is where it begins to shift, because people are not always as consistent as the impression they leave behind. And what feels like depth can sometimes be timing. What feels like understanding can be a moment of alignment. Nothing more. It is an uncomfortable thought that a single honest moment can lead you to build an entire picture of someone. A picture they never quite agreed to carry. And later, when something doesn't match, when their response feels smaller, or slower, or slightly out of place, it is tempting to think they have changed. But perhaps they haven't changed at all. Perhaps you simply saw more than was really there. Or rather, you added something quiet, something hopeful. And when that addition begins to fall away, it doesn't feel like correction. It feels like loss. That is why it rarely feels sudden. It doesn't arrive like a shock. It settles, slowly, in small moments that don't quite sit right. A pause that lasts a bit too long. A reply that feels thinner than before. A silence where there used to be ease. And you notice it, not immediately, but once you do, it is difficult to ignore. There was something he may have come to understand quite late. People rarely disappoint all at once. They narrow, they simplify, they return to what they can actually sustain. And that is often less than what you believed. There are moments when people sound certain, not loudly, just steady. A sentence delivered without hesitation. A promise that feels considered, not rushed. The sort of tone that makes you believe they have already thought it through. You tend to trust that, not because it is perfect, but because it feels grounded. And for a while, it holds, until something small begins to press against it. Not a crisis, just a bit of pressure. Time, expectation, inconvenience. And that is usually when the tone changes. Not dramatically, just enough. A slight hesitation where there used to be ease. A softer version of what was once firm. And you begin to notice something. People often sound stronger than they are. Not intentionally. They believe it in the moment. But belief is light when nothing is testing it. He may have come to see that rather late. That many people are not false. They are simply untested. And what feels like certainty can dissolve quietly when it meets reality. Then something changes. Not in them at first. In the situation. Everything becomes a little less comfortable. A little less easy to maintain. And that is where another shift appears. There are people who stay. And there are people who stay while it is easy. At first it looks the same. They are present. They respond. They seem consistent. You might even begin to rely on it. Not heavily, just enough to feel at ease. But when something begins to cost them time, effort, a bit of discomfort, that is when the pattern adjusts. Replies take longer. Presence becomes occasional. Tone grows more careful. Not colder, just lighter. As if they are slowly reducing the weight they are willing to carry. It is not a dramatic leaving. It is a quiet rebalancing. And that can be harder to accept, because nothing clearly ends. It simply becomes less. He may have noticed that what we often call loyalty is sometimes only alignment with ease. And when ease disappears, so does the appearance of steadiness. There was another kind of silence he might have recognized. The kind that follows a mistake. Not a large one, just something that could have been acknowledged, corrected, left behind. But instead, it lingers. Because not everyone can say it. I was wrong. It seems like a simple sentence. But for some, it carries more weight than they can hold. So they adjust around it. They explain. They deflect. They grow quiet. And over time, that quiet becomes a pattern. What they cannot admit begins to shape how they behave. Not loudly, but consistently. You start to see it in small ways. A resistance to certain conversations. A reluctance to revisit certain moments. A preference for distance over clarity. It is not always pride in the obvious sense. Sometimes it looks like dignity, composure, self-control. But underneath there is something unresolved, and that something quietly directs everything else. He may have understood that quite late, that people are not only shaped by what they believe, but by what they cannot bring themselves to face. And later perhaps he noticed something even quieter. People speak of truth as if it is something they want. They say they prefer honesty, clarity, directness, and often they do, as long as it does not ask too much of them, as long as it does not change how they see themselves, as long as it does not require them to shift. But when truth begins to press against comfort, the response changes, not abruptly, just subtly. The conversation softens, the subject moves, the distance increases, not because the truth is unclear, but because it is inconvenient. And not everyone is willing to sit with that. He may have realized that offering honesty does not guarantee connection. Sometimes it creates space, because not everyone is looking for what is real. Some are only looking for what feels manageable. By then something else may have settled. Not a conclusion, just a quiet adjustment. There are people you meet who seem deeper, not in what they say, but in how they listen, how they pause, how they respond in a way that feels considered. And in those moments, it is easy to believe you have found something rare, someone consistent, someone who sees things in a similar way. You don't declare it, you don't rush it, but you begin to place a certain weight on them, gradually, without noticing. And then at some point, they don't carry it, not fully, not in the way you expected. The response is shorter, the understanding less precise, the presence inconsistent. And it is confusing, because nothing dramatic has happened. There is no clear reason, only a quiet mismatch. He may have come to understand this last, that sometimes the depth you saw was not something they could sustain. It was a moment, a brief alignment, not a foundation. And the difficulty is not what they did. It is what you believed they would continue to be. That is where it settles. Not as anger, not even as disappointment in the usual sense, just a soft, persistent awareness that you may have asked more of them than they ever had to give. And once that becomes clear, something shifts. You stop trying to resolve it. You stop revisiting it. You simply see it. And in seeing it, you begin quietly to expect less. If you've ever left a conversation and kept replaying it on the way home, you may already understand this, not because something obvious was said, but because something felt slightly off. A pause that lingered, a reply that didn't quite meet you where you expected, a tone that shifted just enough to stay polite. You don't react to it straight away. You carry it through the evening, through the quiet moments, perhaps standing by the window, watching the rain settle on the glass, or sitting in the car a little longer than necessary, engine off, not quite ready to move. It returns that feeling, not sharp, just persistent. And slowly, it begins to form into something clearer. Not everyone is able to meet you where you stand, not because they mean harm, but because they are not built for that kind of weight. Some people can listen, but not hold. Some can understand, but not remain. Some can be present, but only for a while. It is not always a failure. Sometimes it is simply a limit. And perhaps that is what takes time to accept. Because we don't just respond to who people are. We respond to who we thought they could be. And letting go of that takes longer than we expect. There is a quiet moment when it begins to ease, not disappear, just soften. You stop expecting certain answers. You stop waiting for a consistency that never quite arrives. You stop trying to make sense of something that no longer fits. And in its place, something simpler appears. Not indifference, not distance, just a kind of clarity, a recognition that some things were never meant to carry as much meaning as you gave them. It feels harsh at first, a little cold, But then, rather unexpectedly, it begins to feel like relief. The room is quieter now, not empty, just settled. The sort of quiet that arrives after everything has already been said. A cup left untouched for a while. The surface cooled. A faint reflection in the window blurred by rain. He may have sat with that kind of stillness, not searching for answers anymore, not turning things over, just letting them rest. By then there is very little need to prove anything, very little desire to correct what has already passed. People remain as they are, or perhaps as they have always been, and what changes is not them. It is the way you hold them in your mind. A little lighter, a little less certain, a little more accurate. There is something almost gentle in that. Not forgiveness, not detachment, just a quieter way of seeing. And once that settles, you no longer feel the need to go back and understand why someone didn't stay the same. You no longer try to reconstruct what was never quite stable to begin with. You simply let the thought pass, like the sound of rain easing outside. And perhaps they didn't really change at all. You just saw them a bit too early.